Namaste. Welcome to Urban Chatterati. This is Abhinav Prakash. And today I'm joined by Harsh Gupta, author, investor, and economist, to discuss the economic impact of the second wave of the pandemic and the evolving, or let's say, what can be the future economic growth pattern of India. So, Harsh, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Abhinav. I must say I have watched many of your episodes, and this is one of the most thoughtful podcasts on YouTube.
Thank you, Harsh. So, Harsh, let's start with the topic of the second wave itself. What is the economic impact of the second wave? We are seeing disruptions in the economy once again. There are lockdowns at various states, and the middle class has suffered a lot. If you see the middle class suffered a lot during the first wave itself because of lockdowns, job loss, salary cuts. Of course, the lower class, the lower income group suffered much more, but middle class also suffered. But now with the second wave, is the middle class which has been struck very hard.
So Abhinav, absolutely. I mean, of course, the first and foremost, the damage is to human life and the massive emotional damage for the survivors, the families. Even going by reported data, it's around 4x right now, the peak compared to the September peak in terms of death and roughly in terms of cases as well. Even if you adjust for slightly more underreporting this time, maybe it's 5x. So there is a massive humanitarian damage first and foremost. In terms of the economic damage, we've not had a kind of very stringent national lockdown this time. So we are doing increasingly more stringent lockdowns, but relatively localized. And it has not been a complete halt to all economic activity the way it happened end of last March, and then April and going on to May. And only in June, probably last year, we had unlock 1.0, 2.0, and so on and so forth. So it now depends when this second wave peaks and when we start seeing some unlocking of those localized lockdowns as well. Because if we do not extend these lockdowns by another couple of weeks or not more than another couple of weeks, so by end of May or by the last week of May, we start unlocking. I think the damage, while very much there, will be relatively limited because you see what has happened is they've actually shut down a lot of offline retail commerce, right? Small shops and so on and so forth. They've not necessarily shut down industries. But obviously, industries work on inventory, factories work on inventory. So if there is not much demand, beyond a few weeks, there is no point for you to remain on. For example, Maruti has said for the next 2 weeks, so we'll prepone our maintenance that we do annually. We'll use this time to do the maintenance. We won't kind of overproduce and add to our inventory. So I think we are very close to this damage becoming much more severe in economic terms if the second wave does not properly peak within May. So right now, I think in terms of economic growth, obviously the damage is there. It's not as bad as last year's lockdown. And even in terms of inflation, for example, because with the last year's, while of course demand fell dramatically, but because there was supply side, all these kinds of frictions that actually showed up in higher CPI data. So even ignoring the base effect, this could happen again this time, but much less so far, because it's not a complete lockdown in that sense. And people have adjusted, at least in terms of companies. It's, people know the kind of, so it's, again, I must say it's much easier for white collar workers than blue collar workers. So your question of middle class will suffer much less this time. The blue collar workers will also suffer less in terms of there won't be massive migrations to villages and back and those kind of very, very tragic humanitarian scenes. But in terms of all these casual jobs on a daily basis, which are not pakka jobs, which are not formal jobs, those are already suffering. So I think it all depends on when the second wave peaks. We are probably, so the government has given 2 months of ration or of almost free ration, which is probably good because, FCI anyways has too much grains. But if it goes beyond that, then we'll have to start thinking of income supplements, direct cash transfers. But let's see. Right now, the data shows that we'll probably peak around mid-May or maybe 1 week later after that in terms of deaths.
Yeah. But when we talk about the middle class, Harsh, in the last 5 years, the middle class has suffered 3 major shocks. The first one was demonetization, and especially through its impact on the real estate sector. Millions of people invested in flats, they bought the flat, they never got it. So it was a massive wealth shock which the middle class suffered. And then last year, because of the national lockdown, there were massive job loss, salary cuts. It's much more difficult to find jobs today for the people who are passing out from the college, from the middle class families. And now in the second wave, the catastrophic health expenditure, which has wiped out the savings of large number of people. And remember, India is not a nuclear family society still, so you still have very strong relation with the other members of the family. So they also chip in the health expenditure. So their money is also gone. In many cases, the person is also gone. Do you think middle class can recover from this tragic setback?
Well, once again, I think the setback is very huge and tragic in a humanitarian way. Um, However, the India growth story is, and I don't mean to say this in any insensitive way, much larger than even this big disaster. So I don't think there will be, in fact, if you do a medium to long term, we can come to that in a moment. If you do before and after, like a Bayesian update, because of this tragedy, I think medium to long term Indian growth fortunes or probabilities have actually increased. But in the short to medium term, the damage, both in material terms but also in psychological terms, is definitely there. Um, so I think not just last 3 years, last 4 5 years, you're right. There was demonetization in November 2016. Then there was GST. There was RERA, something that you mentioned about real estate. In general, there was inflation targeting, which we have renewed right now. So that also leads to lower growth while inflation expectations come down. Then obviously we had a big election. Now we have state elections, and then we have 2 waves and 2 lockdowns, one national and right now localized so far. So what I've called Modinomics earlier, the short-term pain, long-term gain, the pain is getting extended and extended, and the gain is getting further and further away. So I don't blame people if they are right now angry or very skeptical that this is like some khazana which will never come. It's like a story that people like Harsh are saying to kind of mollify people. It's like Santa Claus's gift, which never happens in real life. It's actually your parents who put that. So it is a very the India story has gotten delayed in the short to medium term. Again, not in the long term. Definitely because of these cumulative things, which are again intentionally or otherwise beneficial in the long term. They've gotten delayed by 2 3 years in the short to medium term, and that is very painful because, as you mentioned, people buy flats. Sometimes their EMI counters are kicking, but they've not gotten the possession. Or if they've gotten the possession, the rest of the apartment complex is not really developed. It's not livable. And then all downstream, right? Once the real estate cycle slows, it is the second biggest blue collar job creator after agriculture. So there is a massive kind of negative trickle down effect in that case. So I think in the short to medium term, especially short term, there is no way to spin it. It is deeply damaging. But I must say that a couple of things on the fiscal and monetary side, the government has, on the fiscal side, set aside orthodoxy that, 60-70% above that, if you cross debt to GDP, that'd be wrong. No, they've actually said, okay, we'll have a much more gentle fiscal consolidation part to 2025, 2026, as was announced in this budget. And we had a lot of space left. So now that the second wave has come much more unanticipated and larger than expected, we still have some room to play there. And on the monetary side, while we have renewed inflation targeting, in terms of other unconventional non-rate instruments, in terms of buying dollars, in terms of flooding the market with liquidity, this governor, the RBI Governor Das, has, I would say, done a more than satisfactory job, definitely compared to his predecessor. So it seems that we will not do any more structural reforms right now. We will just make sure that they get slowly enforced and implemented, because farm reforms, labor reforms are all in quasi suspension right now.
Yeah.
So less supply side for the next few months and maybe 1 or 2 years, and making sure that the demand side is more managed. And the only kind of box, the kind of trick in the box is infrastructure, which is short-term demand creating and long-term supply efficiency creating. So that's one thing that, if executed well, which in India is always a bit of a question mark because of land acquisition, environmental regulations, judicial delays. But nonetheless, we have good ministers like Nitin Gadkari who are executing very well. For example, on highways, we have an all-time high of 37 kilometers per day already achieved last year. Now this year we're targeting 40 kilometers, which seems doable. It's only 3 kilometers more. So I think in that sense, the mid to long term, and then there's technology which we can discuss. But in the short term, I fully agree with you. In terms of savings being used, in terms of jobs being converted to part-time jobs or no jobs at all, this is a very difficult time for most Indians, except a very thin layer of privileged people.
Yeah, but you are saying it again and again that the medium to long term prospects of Indian economy remain unchanged, or in fact may have become better. Why are you making that assertion?
Uh, I think thank you for picking out that point, because I think it's important for me to explain that, as it might definitely sound counterintuitive. So I think, see, what is growth in a way, right? But growth is for an X amount of salary. If you can live at a lower Y amount of rent, you have more disposable income, right? In a way, if you think from a typical lower middle class, even upper middle class kind of sensibility, you are basically thinking in terms of how much you're saving per month. And part of that will go to discretionary, what we call discretionary consumption. It's not necessary consumption. And that's what kind of runs and fuels the economy. So what has happened is this work from home, the way you and I are talking right now. Earlier podcasts, it was fine for people to do talk shows like this. But if I was to meet a client like this, they would say, they would assume, even though the technology was already there, by the way, they would assume, why is Harsh not coming to meet me in the office? Is he not a serious business provider? Am I not important enough to be, kind of met in person? And vice. So there were all these things which are not government related or even technology related, but they were just inertia. There was certain inertia that you have to have a certain Tony office in this part of city or town. You have to do certain kind of meetings. Now, a lot of that friction has evaporated. And while we will never go to full work from home, a lot of companies are talking about hybrid models. So they say, for example, instead of 5 days coming to office, why don't you come for 3 days? 2 days, we trust you to work from anywhere you want. So you have your key deliverables, you have your KPIs. And that allows a person to say, well, if I have office in central Delhi, then maybe I don't have to live in Noida. I can probably live in Greater Noida. If I can live in Greater Noida, for example, if I can live in Ghaziabad or wherever, then I can get a bigger place at lower rent, because I've had this experience of work from home. My children needed their own separate room for school and college classes. So suddenly, suburbanization in India has increased. So now this is kind of an immediate impact. And then think about it. Think if you're an American executive and some of your team members from New York went back to Boston, and you're working like that, right? Now you're thinking, well, if he or she, my junior, is working from Boston instead of New York, how does it really matter beyond a point if he's sitting in Nagpur? Right. I mean, of course, there's a time difference. I'm not saying it is one-on-one smooth, but the point is, suddenly the scope of outsourcing to India has massively increased. And Indian IT companies, by the way, are doing very well, not just because now globally you need much more digitalization, largely and partially because of this pandemic, but also because now people are thinking there is so much more we could outsource, because you cannot live on less than $100,000 if you have even one child in Manhattan. It's almost impossible. Whereas you can live a king's life at half the salary in any large city of India. So those kind of things which are not tradable. So like generally, like Rajiv and I, my co-author, we've written about it. Generally, goods are considered tradable historically, if you think in the conventional economic sense, and services have not, right? The classic example of service is a haircut. A haircut has to be consumed locally. But more and more, especially high-end services, can now be consumed, and that whole process has gotten accelerated because of the pandemic. And because India never really quite solved the manufacturing exports puzzle so far, we were, since the 90s, we were basically coasting on this IT boom. This novel middle class was created first by BPO, then IT companies, and now what are called global capability centers. So in-house back offices, KPOs, all the big banks and companies, Fortune 500, they all have some office in Hyderabad or Pune or Bangalore or Gurgaon, Noida. And like a medium-sized British bank could have 20,000, 10,000 Indian workers. For them in dollar or pound terms, the salary is nothing and the service is amazing. So that thing, because anyways, we have more and more demographically number and more educated people coming up, and the world requires cost cutting. While there will be some automation, which also, by the way, Indian techies can help with, but where there is not automation, a lot of these jobs will come more and more to India. And then there's a downstream effect. Every job creates real estate. They go out and spend on the malls and multiplexes. So it's not necessarily ideal, but that process has gotten ahead by 5 years, 3 years. So in that broader sense of outsourcing 3.0, if you want to call it, if you don't want to use the word outsourcing, it is considered too low class by some people. You can use some other words. That business process sharing has gotten accelerated, and that has actually been the creator of what you and I see as middle class jobs. Although by Indian income percentiles they're actually upper middle class, but what you and I would conventionally call in a narrative sense middle class jobs, private sector middle class jobs. So that process has gotten accelerated. And while the world has come back with a vengeance in terms of massive fiscal and monetary stimuli in the West, in Japan, China a bit less so because China already had a massive debt to begin with. All those, whether it's in terms of commodities, in terms of services, they're all kind of overflowing to India. So Indian talent is there, Indian numbers are there, the demand is there. Technology was there, it has gotten better, and now the inertia against using the technology has reduced in a sociological sense. And that has massive downstream effects. And of course, that is my answer to why it has become more bullish. Why I was bullish to begin with, there are separate set of answers, but why it has become slightly more bullish, as tragic as the short term is. And I don't mean to minimize it at all by sounding very optimistic and pan-Glosian when people are dying in hundreds and thousands every day. But if we are to dispassionately analyze that, that would be my answer.
Yeah, I'm getting the point there. But you have been mentioning automation and the technologies and so on. So, what kind of technological restructuring you see apart from this work from home culture, and what new technologies might get a legs up that their advancement development gets accelerated? Anyways, we are on the brink of the fourth industrial revolution. What impact that will have on India?
So I think again that's an excellent question. It kind of broad bases within the context of the pandemic, but beyond it as well. So what has happened is we are right now, so in India, thanks to Geo, but thanks to other companies as well, we kind of finally caught on to 4G LTE, right? So this time we are, instead of 5 or 7 years behind, we are maybe 2 years behind on maybe we'll be just 2 years behind on 5G, which is about to come. 5G will be a factor of magnitude faster. Latency will be lower, and you can therefore have much more critical applications in terms of a doctor from far away seeing in a small town of India, let's say somebody of the caliber of Naresh Trihan or slightly lower in a big Indian city or even outside of India, looking at a small town in India or somewhere else, a junior surgeon doing some surgery somewhere else. So you need very good connectivity for that and low latency because obviously lives are at stake. So 5G has that application. It has self-driving applications in another 5 or 10 years. So data speed becomes much faster. On top of that, this work from home then goes from 2D to 3D. And again, we are in the early days of that. If you look at Microsoft HoloLens, you look at Microsoft Mesh. So they're doing virtual reality, but more interestingly, what's known as augmented reality. So right now, one-on-one, this conversation feels great. But if you have 4 or 5 people, I have to look at one screen, right? Which may not be so great after say 20, 30 minutes. But if I have augmented reality, it's almost like as if 3, 4 people are sitting in the room with me. Now, whether it's like a holoportation or like Star Trek style, or it is actually a symbolic representation of the person, if he or she prefers more privacy, that can be done. So, and that has again huge applications. For example, already we are doing teaching through Zoom, but again there is a certain 2D-ness to it. But imagine if you had in a Delhi University classroom 40 students sitting, or say 20 students sitting physically, 20 students holoporting from their homes, and the professor also holoporting in some kind of special classes from Yale or Harvard, or vice versa. If you do from Delhi to Connecticut, and therefore again the salary difference comes up. So what is happening is the death of distance is not complete, but it has become much faster. So that's on the information and communication side. The other massive change which is there, which precedes COVID, so and information is bits and bytes. In terms of atoms and molecules, we have energy, we have moving stuff. And finally, what we are seeing, and this does not have anything directly to do with COVID, is solar energy and to some extent wind energy, but along with storage, getting not just cheap enough compared to coal or natural gas, etc., but starting to looking at the trend, getting significantly cheaper in another 3, 4 years. So that allows massive productivity boost, right? We might get to self-driving cars later, maybe 10 years from now. But electric vehicles and hybrid cars are already getting close to on a totalized cost of ownership, not on a sticker price basis. We are already getting there, including in India. So while China might be ahead on this and massively in terms of industrial and trade policy, so imagine what is India's one of the biggest macro costs. It is importation of crude. If you don't no longer import crude, but India has enough solar exposure, so you basically don't buy that energy from outside of India. That changes your macro dramatically, right? So in sector after sector, in terms of technology, a lot of it is, by the way, exogenous. We are not necessarily inventing this stuff, but increasingly, again, through those global capability centers, a lot of our talent is a key part of inventing that stuff. So that technology is there. This government, for all its faults, is amazing on infrastructure. And infrastructure is very important if you want to grow outside of 3-4 core city centers. So that will take some time to play off, and I think we are in the beginning of another real estate boom like 2003 right now. But this time the boom will be more on quantity of houses or flats and not necessarily the price going 10x, because this time the catchment area is much larger because of these expressways, and again work from home. So you basically have much more technology. You have cheaper energy in cars soon. You can live further, work digitally, even people in not necessarily very high premium white collar jobs. So of course, this impact in India, it helps because we start from very low base. In developed countries, it helps a bit more in a different way because much more of their workforce is white collar. In India, obviously, we are white collar jobs are fewer in India as a percentage terms. So it kind of balances out in that sense. So India is very well poised for a variety of reasons. And the final reason, along with infrastructure technology, is state capacity, which has seen a massive exposure right now in terms of being exposed during COVID, no doubt about that. But again, if we are objective about it, last 7 years and even before that, the kind of digital governance capabilities we have made, be it the Jam Trinity, right? In terms of just sending, at least the option is now on the table, which is not there 10 years earlier. Imagine even our courts, our famously small c conservative courts, we're now having web sessions even right now. So if you can, now a lawyer sitting in Calcutta can appear in the Supreme Court. Earlier, it was not possible physically, which, by the way, is leading to some backlash in terms of Supreme Court lawyer unions, etc., saying, what is the point of us being in Delhi if others can also appear? But all these innovations are happening not because anybody wants them to happen, because they have been forced upon us. There's been a restructuring of Indian railways. There's been a restructuring of Indian armed forces. We now have a joint command. There is at least at a very marginal level, lateral entry has started in the Indian bureaucracy. Again, long way to go. I'm not at all saying we have anywhere close to first world bureaucratic or governance standards, but the delta and the increment overall, despite this massive tragedy, is in the right direction. So I think a lot of economics has to be seen in a broader political, in fact, political and social economic setup. And then if you go to the social point, finally, why I'm bullish, actually, somebody who can explain this better than me is you, Abhinav, is we are actually seeing a bit more coherence in the Indian society. And if you take a long term, these trends are slow, but in terms of civilizational lengths, it's very fast. So what is happening in the last 30, 40 years? So what I've called in a new idea of India is the civilization is turning into a nation. So it's very seamless for me to go and relocate from Kolkata to Pune to Bangalore to Delhi, right? It's very seamless, which it was not necessarily 30, 40 years ago. So that kind of labor mobility, that kind of understanding that we are not just one person, one nation in a constitutional paper sense, but we are increasingly feeling it. I think that is actually the bedrock on top of which the state is there. And the state is allowing technology to be absorbed for faster economic growth without us becoming a digital colony to that extent. So we have a more activist state, which means they'll make some mistakes. This Atmanirbhar Bharat, people kind of misunderstand that as import substitution. It is import substitution, but allowing foreign companies to make it, allowing full domestic free markets. It's not like Nehruvian import substitution. There's no licenses here. It's saying, India has had industrial policy in cars for 30, 40 years. But so we are saying Bhar ka kari import mat karo, but all our leading manufacturers are actually foreign, South Korean or Japanese. So it's a different kind of model. So for a lot of variety of reasons, the only reason the numbers have not shown is because of this pandemic. And before that, we were in a kind of macroeconomic downturn, which was exacerbated with our inflation targeting, which was required in the long term. But not to get too, specific, the dollar cycle is a 20-year cycle, a 15, 20-year cycle. when the dollar is getting stronger, a lot of emerging economies like India do relatively weak growth. The
Hmm.
dollar is right now at its peak. So the next 7, 8 years, even in a cyclical sense, which is over and top of the secular trends, the dollar will weaken and emerging markets like India will do well. So there are a lot of reasons to be very bullish from a medium to long term basis, which further have gotten enhanced because of this tragedy, which has nonetheless opened up a lot of new avenues by decreasing various frictions.
Interesting point. As I always say, in fact, this is not my statement, but I believe in this thing that only revolutions in the history are technological revolutions. So technological disruption change the society, they change the social structure, political structure, everything, even our customs, traditions, and culture. But you also pointed out something about the state capacity, the bureaucracy, and the other kind of thing. And we have seen in this pandemic that India has no state capacity. We are the most ungoverned country among the major countries in the world. We were seeing that in Bengal as well. The massive violence on the ground, the state is completely absent. We're seeing in the case of the pandemic, the state is absent. What about state capacity going forward? How we need to augment it and make sure that we are no longer that old India where you only have the state for the namesake and everything is lawless below it.
So I think this is the nub of the question, actually. This is the nub of the $1 trillion question of the India story. And it's very interesting to me the way you framed the question. You started off by saying technology and then you went to state capacity. And I'll actually make a provocative statement by saying actually a state is also a technology. The state is actually the ultimate technology of organizing ourselves, right? A technology we think in terms of applied science. Sure, in a narrow sense, the state is not a
Well,
technology.
technique. There's a book, Technological Society. I'm forgetting the name of the French philosopher.
Yeah, so I think I also remember it. I don't remember the name right now. So a state
French
is
names are difficult to remember.
the state is basically technology, right? A state is basically something that came out of first the European religious civil war, then which further kind of had many small parts because of linguistic differences, kind of erupted into colonialism and two world wars. They had some ethnic homogenization, linguistic homogenization, and we had these very capable states after all these tragedies, which could basically redirect people's resources into long-term investments and providing a floor for the most vulnerable people, right? So a welfare state, but a growth-oriented state, which in shallow discourse are seen as the opposites, but they're actually the one and the same. And actually, if you look at the smaller the state, the more homogeneous the state, the richer the state, the larger the government spending as a percentage of GDP. Right. So you again, libertarianism and welfareism are not necessarily orthogonal to each other. So in state capacity in India, you rightly mentioned, you hinted at two parts, right? One is the welfareist part. The other is the core responsibility of having monopoly on violence. What we are seeing in West Bengal is obviously a dereliction of that core responsibility. Now, I'm not obviously saying there's no state, because as tragic as it is, no state would have meant 100 times more casualties, right? So, I mean, there is a state, but it's not good enough compared to any large developed country, as you rightly mentioned. Similarly, of course, there is a state for health capacity as well, but nothing to be remotely proud of. In fact, a lot to be ashamed of given what we are seeing in Delhi and parts of India. So, how do we go about building that? And I think, see, this is what, in a way, Narendra Modi's intuition was to have formalization, which leads to more tax revenue, which you kind of invest into state. And to be fair to Narendra Modi, for all the mistakes the government has done and definitely was being complicit about a second wave, I don't think there is any way to spin that off. But to be fair to Narendra Modi, the Ayushman Bharat program was launched by him pre-pandemic, right? Now, of course, it can never be NHS of the UK because we are $2,000 per capita income. The UK is 25 times more. Even if you adjust for cost of living differences, 7-8 times more. So it's difficult to you can't invent mountains out of thin air. You first need to be rich to even have that capacity. But there is a big problem that the Indian state is too heavy and not good at its core responsibilities, whereas it is trying its hands at multiple things which is not supposed to do. So, for example, policing costs, if you increment policing cost a bit as a percent of GDP, that by itself could lead to a massive improvement in policing, even if the politicized chief minister control remains in the name of federalism. For example, in the US now it has become common after these, before that also, but especially after Black Lives Matter and some of these very unfair killings by some police officers, A lot of these police officers, especially during these, when they go interrogate somebody, there's some kind of encounter, they wear these cameras on them. Again, it's a small technology that is not, again, it's very easy to put. It's not like Indian police officers can't afford wearing that. It's a cultural mindset change. How to be sensitive towards people you are about to arrest, how to be sensitive towards women if you are bringing them to the police station in any form. On the other hand, Indian society is also at problem here, because in India we are more afraid of the police inside the police station and less afraid of them outside. It should be the opposite. We should be really afraid of the police outside, but in farmer protests, other protests, we are not afraid of them. Whereas inside, there should be no extrajudicial torture. Either ulta hai. So there is a lot of work to do on policing, on bureaucracy, and on judiciary. And I think these are the real reforms now we need to do. We need to get out of this kind of narrow understanding of economic reforms or free market reforms. I think for now we are good enough there. I'm not saying there's not anything more to be done there, but for now we have kind of optimized there. But what this pandemic has shown, as you rightly mentioned, is we can no longer delay what can broadly be called administrative reforms, state capacity enhancement. That is the only way we go, what is known as the middle income trap, whether it's empirically true or not. That's the only way we can cross it in 5, 10, 15 years.
Yeah, but let's see, because I don't see our polity is serious about building state capacity, because a weak state benefits lots of factors, lots of vested lobbies.
I agree. I'll just add a caveat. For example, we all know that some southern states also have corruption, right? So the only thing is, we understand, or what we hear from people is there is centralized corruption, right? You have to give so much money to the CMO for election expenses, is what we hear, and no local level gunda will harm your factory or try to extort you. And a lot of these southern states have done very well on healthcare capacity management as well. In Tamil Nadu, they're doing well. Even in Kerala, they're doing well. Look at the young MP from Bangalore South, Tejasvi Surya. In 2 days, he was able to expose that in BBMP hospitals were basically having false patients for 1,500 beds.
And how they did it? They look at the data of 100,000 hospitalization, and they pointed out something wrong is going on. Yeah, because he has a team which can look into it.
He has a team. He himself is very smart. But I'm saying more broadly, this makes me bullish on state capacity going forward, because there will be more people like that who will be young and dynamic and have some basic common sense and intelligence about how to find out these problems. So I think because the southern states are economically and demographically, say 10, 15 years ahead of some northern states, it gives me some hope in terms of how things will play out. But you're absolutely right that it's not front and center of the political agenda right now. And that is something we have to keep on pushing and changing, because nothing is predestined. Let us be as optimistic as I am, it is not predestined.
True. So my final question to you, Harsh, is about the wider geoeconomics of this pandemic, and especially in the context of increasing, let's say, competition or rivalry between India and China. We've just seen that India has excluded the China from the 5G trials. So how do you see the entire geoeconomics of the region of the world shaping up in the future, in the post-pandemic world?
So I think, again, you're right. In the short term, we are kind of excluding the Chinese from 5G trials, and it might be permanent or it might be somewhat contingent upon further de-escalation in the remaining areas of Eastern Ladakh. So, for example, we kind of de-escalated in Kailash range, but that was slightly more advantageous to us. And now that the Chinese have kind of stalled because they're again sensing weakness, we are busy with the second wave. So this is one way of kind of also blackmailing them. So if you completely take it off the table, which I personally think we should, it has national security implications. But if you 100% take it off the table, then you lose one bargaining chip. So that's a very specific answer to that particular question. I think more broadly, it depends as to what view you take of economic growth going forward post-pandemic and how that will play into geoeconomics. So on China, we are definitely in for tough times, because China is at the peak of its growth rate, not in terms of percentage, but in terms of the differential between India and China. In my view, is probably at the peak right now. And I think the Chinese also understand it in a, not just an economic sense, but also in a demographic sense. So they are also understanding if they want to lock in some advantages, the next couple of years are the best time to lock those advantages in. Before India starts rising again, or India and America get closer, etc., and the Quad becomes more organized. Right now, it's more a concept than organized as such. It's not remotely a nation, NATO. I think more broadly, if you think about it, it's very interesting what's happening with Pakistan. Because in Pakistan, the military has been making a lot of noises about we want to go towards geo-economics from geopolitics. Now, there's many a slip between the cup and the lip, especially when it comes to Pakistan, because Musharraf tried it in a different way, and then he was kicked out. Although ostensibly because of judicial protests, but this was also another part of it. Kayani after him did not continue that policy. And right now, Bajwa is facing a lot of protests that why are you even trying to talk to India without India repealing 370, the repeal of 370, without removing the repeal of 370. So what we are seeing is while there is less globalization relative to the peak of globalization by 2007, globalization itself remains very important. And as we discussed, it might be more in services relatively compared to goods going forward, relatively. And what Pakistan is realizing is it is at a crossroads where it further just can no longer coerce India. And it is seeing that the Bangladesh model of integrating into India has paid off massive dividends to Bangladesh. The only problem is Bangladesh does not have the quote unquote dubious honor of saying we stood up to Hindu India. Right? I mean, that psychological high of not standing up to Hindu India is something Bangladeshis are missing, and Pakistanis have to decide whether they want that psychological high or whether they want a functioning economy. And I have a feeling that in 1 or 2 years, they'll end up choosing trading with India, which will be a massive change in India's geopolitics, because we've not made that assumption. And I'm not at all saying it will happen for sure. But I think the chances are getting more and more that Pakistan is at very much cornered. It has really no option left except to, like China and Japan have disputes on a few islands, but they've said we'll continue trading and we'll try to solve this in 10, 20, 50 years. So the moment that India and Pakistan reach that understanding, a very different subcontinent opens up. There's obviously more trade and Pakistan benefits more than India. And India, being a relatively status quoist power, can say to Pakistan that if you now do a terror attack, because you're more integrated into us, we can cut your trade off. The way China weaponizes trade. So I think we are back to not mercantilism, but we are back to somewhere halfway between free trade and mercantilism, and how that is weaponized for good or bad reason by larger economies. And that is something which will be used both against India and by India against its own adversaries. And I think what the pandemic has done is on these conventional metrics, it added a sense of technology being very important. So what we are seeing in social media disputes, because technology has a sense of winner takes all. If you're a massive company, just what is known as network externalities of scale, positive network externalities, you are likely to be larger and larger unless some government or jurisdiction says we will actively benefit national champions of our own. So technology has a different kind of economics than a steel factory. Like if you're Netflix, it's much more likely that it will become larger, especially if you're Facebook, which is literally a network. Because if everybody else is on Facebook, even if you don't want to be on Facebook, you have to be on Facebook. Similarly with Twitter. So I think India right now will not necessarily play that card with the United States because there are other reasons to be with the US against China and so on and so forth. But I see a clash coming up between India and America as well on technology and technology-based protectionism. It's already started, but I see it much more serious 3-4 years from now. Because in a post-pandemic world, the importance of technology for economic growth has become even more pronounced. And you just cannot let, it is a bit exaggerated, a lot of rhetoric in it. You cannot allow India to become a digital colony this time. So I think those are some key trends to look out for. The way Pakistan-India relations, China-India relations, and US-India relations on technology evolve in the coming years.
Interesting point. I'm not that hopeful on the Pakistan's front, but yeah, you are right about the US and India relations. I had the honor to host Vikram Sood sir some time back, and he said that this sudden, campaign that India is no longer a democracy, India is an autocracy, India has human rights violation, genocide going on in India, has much to do with the power shift in the post-pandemic world, where the Western world realizes that they have to fix India in the future. So they are preparing the ground. It's much more difficult to take action against a democracy. It's much more easier to rally their population against a not democracy. So
I fully agree. And in fact, what Sir Vikram Sood sir said, I think he's absolutely right, because Actually, if you read Financial Times, Economist, and whereas UK, US publications, for example, India has a requirement. Last 2 3 years, we've been talking about data localization. So basically, we've been saying Indian data on Indian server farms, which also creates local jobs and infrastructure. That was a big sticking point because what the way technology is, either you are on the high table or you are dinner on the high table. It's very binary in that sense. Like, because technology, even more than other industries, completely converges on 2 or 3 centers. Like, one huge one will be China because they walled off their internet, and Shenzhen is their hardware center. Silicon Valley obviously is the world's and America's leading center. So the question is, will Bangalore be a third pole, or will Bangalore remain also be in? That is the big question, because this is 1 or 0, unfortunately, compared to other industries. And if Bangalore is also on the high table, it is obviously not that convenient for American companies, because after losing China, they thought they had the massive Indian market. And because Africa is not united right now and it is poorer and younger, so right now there is no threat from Africa that there could be in 20, 30 years. But they're basically saying either we have Indian consumers, else we'll end up having Indian competitors. And remember, Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos. Again, I'm not saying these things happen directly or there's a conscious bias, but these things have a way of coming out.
Yeah.
So I think what Vikram Sood sir said to you is in that context also very relevant.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you, Harsh, for talking to us. It was a wonderful discussion. Always a pleasure to talk to you. And thank you, audience, for listening to us. Don't forget to subscribe and join the channel as the member if you like. See you soon.
Thank you, Abhinav. Thank you so much for having me.